In the park, I saw my son sitting on a bench with a small child and a few suitcases. I asked, "Why are you here?" "I got fired, Dad." I looked at the boy clinging tightly to my son's hand. I smiled, "Get in the car." My son had no idea that I already knew everything. He had no idea that I'd been waiting for this moment. And he certainly had no idea that what was about to happen next would change everything. Hey everyone, thanks for being here. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of this incredible journey. Drop a comment below and tell us what would you have done in Richard's position. Also remember, while this story is inspired by real events, some details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. The lessons, however, are absolutely authentic. The first thing I notice is the cold. Central Park in late October doesn't mess around. The wind cuts through the morning air like a blade, and the last of the leaves scatter across the pavement in burnt orange and dying gold. I stand at the top of the hill overlooking Bethesda Terrace. Hands shoved deep in my charcoal coat pockets, watching. Just watching. Not moving. Not breathing hard. Just observing like a man who has spent 40 years learning that patience is the most valuable currency in the world. 30 seconds. That's all it takes for me to understand everything. The boy sits on a stone bench maybe 200 yards down the path. Shoulders curved inward, like he's trying to collapse into himself, trying to make himself smaller, less visible, less real. Even from this distance, I can see the tremor in his frame. Jonathan's face is wet, not just tears, but the kind of breakdown that comes from the gut, the kind that makes a man forget he's supposed to be strong. His whole body shakes with the rhythm of someone whose world has just fallen apart. 3 suitcases lie scattered around the bench like abandoned soldiers. Their sides are split open, seams torn, handles cracked. Clothes spill out everywhere, dress shirts that cost $300 a piece, slacks pressed to perfection, silk ties in deep burgundies and navy blues. The good ones. The ones Jonathan wore to that Whitmore Industries office every single morning for the past 3 years. The ones he believed were his armor. The ones he thought would protect him. I paid for most of them myself. Italian leather belts, silk lining, cufflinks from a shop on Madison Avenue. The kind of details that matter to men who are trying to prove something to their fathers. The kind of things that say, "See, I'm doing well. I'm important. I belong here." But he doesn't belong anywhere now. The boy Lucas, 4 years old, with Jonathan's dark eyes and a laugh that could make you believe in second chances, plays a few feet away from his father, crouched down on the cold concrete like he's searching for buried treasure. He's collecting dried leaves, arranging them in a little pile, completely oblivious to the devastation happening 3 feet away. Kids never understand. They can sit beside destruction and still find magic in something as simple as a leaf changing color. "Daddy, why are you sad?" Lucas asks suddenly, his small voice cutting through the October wind like a knife. He's not looking at Jonathan when he says it. His focus is entirely on a particularly good leaf, bright yellow, perfectly shaped like someone designed it in a factory. Jonathan's head comes up at the sound of his son's voice. He tries to smile. I watch him try, watch the muscles in his face fight against the tears, watch my son attempt to manufacture something resembling strength. It takes everything Jonathan has, every ounce of energy he has left after being destroyed. I'm okay, buddy." Jonathan says, his voice cracking on the second word. He's not okay. We both know it. That's when I start walking. My shoes click against the concrete path. Alan Edmonds, $625 a pair, the kind of shoes a man wears when he spent 40 years building things. I don't hurry. I don't slow down either. Some things can't be approached slowly. You either commit to the movement, or you don't move at all. There's no middle ground. Jonathan hears my footsteps and freezes. His entire body goes rigid. His hands go to his face, a useless gesture trying to wipe away tears that won't stop coming, won't quit flowing, won't give him even a moment of dignity. His breath comes in short, sharp bursts, the kind of breathing that comes right before panic sets in. For a moment I can see it in his eyes, the thought of running, the instinct to escape, the desperation to disappear. But he doesn't run. I reach the bench and stand there for 2 full seconds, not moving, not speaking, just standing there, letting my presence settle into the space between us. That's enough for Jonathan to understand that whatever comes next is real. This isn't going away. This isn't a bad dream. Then I sit down, not next to him, just on the bench. The stone is cold through my expensive wool pants, but I don't flinch, don't shift my weight, don't show a single sign of discomfort. When you've learned to control your body, the cold doesn't matter. Pain doesn't matter. Only strategy matters. "Get in the car, son," I say quietly. My voice isn't gentle. It isn't harsh either. It's the voice of a man who has spent 4 decades building empires in the shadows, who has learned that words are only useful when they mean something. And this means something. Every syllable, every breath behind it. Jonathan looks at me, then really looks at me. And in that moment I see something shift behind his eyes. Not surprise, realization, recognition. His pupils widen just enough for me to see the question forming, taking shape, becoming real, "Dad, how much do you know?" Because that's what does it. That's what makes his breathing change, makes his body go even more rigid than it already is. Not the crying, not the rejection, not the 3 ruined suitcases at his feet containing the remnants of a life that has just imploded. It's the look on my face that tells him everything has changed. My expression isn't sad, isn't angry, isn't disappointed in the way fathers usually are. It's cold, calculated, waiting, like I've been expecting this moment, like I've been preparing for it, like I've already thought 10 moves ahead while he's still trying to understand move number 1. And somewhere deep in his chest, something shifts. Fear, maybe, or recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when a son realizes his father was never really on the sidelines. That I've been watching, always watching, calculating, planning. Lucas looks up from his leaf collection, his small face brightening immediately. "Grandpa," he calls out, waving his chubby fist. He runs toward us, leaving a trail of leaves behind him, his small feet pounding against the stone. I don't look at the boy. My eyes stay on Jonathan, just for a moment longer. Long enough for him to understand that this isn't over. This is just beginning. The limo pulls smoothly into traffic on 5th Avenue, and I let my hands rest on the steering wheel, like I'm just another driver in this city of 8 million stories. Through the rearview mirror, I can see Jonathan in the back seat. Lucas already asleep on his lap, the boy's small head tilted against his father's chest. Even unconscious, Lucas holds on one tiny hand, gripping Jonathan's shirt, like it's the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Jonathan stares out the window, watching the city move past us, and I say nothing. Silence is a tool. Most people don't understand that. They rush to fill it with words, with explanations, with desperate attempts to make sense of chaos. But I learned long ago that silence is where the truth lives. We drive for 3 blocks before Jonathan speaks. "I was fired, Dad." His voice comes out small, fractured, like he's asking a question instead of stating a fact. "Victoria said, she said the company doesn't need me anymore." I adjust the mirror slightly, keeping my eyes on the road. Traffic on 5th moves like honey in October, slow and inevitable. Around us, the city glitters with money and ambition, with people who think they've got it all figured out. Most of them are wrong. I don't understand why, Jonathan continues, and I can hear the tremor in his words, now the crack that comes when a man's world collapses in real time. I did everything right, Dad. I was good at my job. I was doing everything they asked me to do. He stops, waits for me to respond. I don't. The silence stretches between us like a live wire. I can feel him wanting to fill it, wanting me to make this better somehow, to say something that will turn back time, that will undo the last 3 hours and put his life back the way it was, but I don't say anything. Not yet. Instead, my mind moves backward to 6 months ago, when I first started noticing things. Small things. Victoria coming home later than usual. The way she looked at her phone when Jonathan entered the room. The careful distance she maintained between them at dinner parties. The kind of distance that only comes when intimacy has died and been replaced by something else, performance. Calculation, and then there was the money. 3 large cash withdrawals from their joint account in a single month. $50,000. Then another 50. Then more. When I asked Jonathan about it casually at lunch, he looked confused. Victoria handles most of our finances, he'd said. I trust her with that. Trust. That word had tasted like poison in my mouth. Then came the Whitmore family events. Edward's hand always on Victoria's shoulder just a beat too long. The way they spoke to each other in a language that excluded everyone else in the room. And most damning, the night I saw her at a hotel on 52nd Street, getting into a car with a man I didn't recognize. A younger man. A man who looked at her the way Jonathan used to look at her, before life wore down his capacity for that kind of devotion. I documented everything. Photos, dates, times. Not because I needed proof, I didn't need proof. I needed to understand how deep the deception ran. We're going home, I say quietly, taking the turn that leads us downtown toward the Hamptons, away from the glitter of Manhattan, and toward the Harrison estate where real power lives in silence and stone. Jonathan looks at me, then finally his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. What? He asks, like he didn't quite hear me, or maybe like he heard me, but the words don't make sense. His world has ended. Why would we be going home like this is just another afternoon? Listen to me, I say, and something in my tone makes him sit straighter, makes him shift his weight, so Lucas doesn't slip from his lap. What happened today, this wasn't about you being fired. This wasn't about your performance or your abilities. You're smart, Jonathan. You're capable. You're exactly the son I raised you to be. His face crumples at the word son. Like hearing it from me makes the whole thing even more real, even more devastating. This is not about saving you. I continue keeping my voice level, keeping it steady, keeping it cold, because cold is what he needs right now, not sympathy. This is not about me coming to your rescue and making everything okay. That's what your mother would have done. That's what most fathers do. But I'm not most fathers. I can see him in the mirror processing this, trying to understand why I'm not comforting him, why I'm not promising him that everything will be fine. But this is about teaching you a lesson, I say, and I hear him take a sharp breath. The men in the Whitmore family, they saw an opportunity and they took it. They saw weakness and they exploited it. That's the world we live in, Jonathan. That's the real world. And today you learned that the hard way. The limo turns onto the highway, heading out of the city, heading toward the estate where the real work begins. From this moment forward, I tell him, everything changes. You're going to learn how power actually works. You're going to understand what it means to survive in a world that doesn't care about your intentions or your effort. You're going to become someone they should have been afraid to mess with. Jonathan doesn't respond. He just holds Lucas closer, and I let the silence settle again. Let him sit with the weight of those words. Lucas shifts in his sleep, his small hand now gripping Jonathan's collar, completely unaware that his whole life has just been redirected by forces he doesn't understand. The city falls away behind us, and I keep my eyes on the road ahead, on the future that's already taking shape in my mind, on the 10 moves I've already planned, while my son is still trying to understand what move one looks like. We're going home, and from there everything begins. 3 years earlier, Sterling Capital's offices sat on the 42nd floor of a building that cost more money than most people see in a lifetime. The kind of building where the windows didn't rattle, where the air was filtered through systems that cost 6 figures to install, where everything about the space whispered that power lived here. I sat at the head of my desk, mahogany from a forest that doesn't exist anymore, purchased at an auction in London, and waited for Jonathan to enter. When he did, he was already nervous. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders, the slight hesitation in his step, like he wasn't sure he belonged in this room, despite the fact that I'd invited him here myself. That hesitation would disappear by the end of our conversation, or it would consume him entirely. There would be no middle ground. "Sit," I told him, gesturing to the chair across from me. He sat. I spent 5 seconds just looking at him, not in a cruel way, but in the way a craftsman examines his material before beginning work. Jonathan was 30 years old at that moment, still soft in places where he needed to be hard, still carrying the weight of his mother's optimism alongside my own pragmatism. The combination had made him decent, but decent wasn't enough for what was coming. "I need you to listen carefully," I said, keeping my voice measured, keeping it steady. "What I'm about to tell you may take many years to understand, and what I'm about to ask of you will cost you more than you think." "Dad, what are you—" Jonathan started, but I held up one hand. Small gesture, complete silence followed. "Victoria has someone else," I said. No preamble, no gentle lead-in, just the truth delivered like a blade. "I've seen the signs for 6 months now. The late nights, the distance between you at home, the way she looks at her phone when you enter a room. I've documented enough to understand that her infidelity is not a moment of weakness. It's a choice. An ongoing choice." Jonathan's face went pale. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish left on dry land, gasping for air that wasn't there. "Kahida, I understand you don't want to hear this," I continued, because sentiment was the enemy of clarity. "I understand you love her. But what you need to understand is that love doesn't protect you in this world. Love is a luxury people buy themselves after they've already survived. Right now, survival is what matters. How long have you known?" Jonathan asked, his voice small, broken. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to understand the depth of it," I said. "I needed to know if this was opportunistic or strategic. Victoria didn't stumble into an affair, Jonathan. She planned it, which means the people behind her, likely her father, are planning something too." I stood and walked to the window, looking out over Manhattan like a king surveying his kingdom. The city sprawled beneath me, 8 million people making 8 million mistakes simultaneously. "When the time comes," I said, still facing the window, "you will join Whitmore Industries. You'll tell them you want to be part of the family business, that you want to prove yourself, that you want to be closer to your wife. They'll accept you because Victoria will encourage it. Her father will welcome you because he sees opportunity, your connections through Sterling Capital, your knowledge of our systems, your access." "You want me to spy on them," Jonathan said behind me. It wasn't a question. "I want you to survive them," I corrected, turning back to face him. "You'll be inside their operation. You'll see everything. You'll understand how they think, how they plan, how they manipulate. Most importantly, you'll gather proof of what they're doing. Documentation, records, whatever you can find that shows the true nature of their business." Jonathan stood up. He paced the room 3 steps one direction, 3 steps back, the way people do when their nervous system is screaming for movement. Then we wait, I continued. You wait for the right moment, and when it comes, we'll move. Move how? Jonathan demanded. Dad, I love her. I know what you just told me about her, but I still love her. I let that statement sit between us like a live wire. Love is not enough. I said finally, each word deliberate and measured. Love doesn't matter when the people you love are strategic about their deceptions. Love doesn't matter when they're willing to sacrifice you to protect themselves. Love is a weakness you cannot afford to indulge in this situation. You need to survive this first. Then you can decide what love means afterward. Jonathan's hands were shaking now. I watched him notice it, watched him try to make them stop. Watched the realization dawn on him that he'd already known on some level that something was wrong. The pieces were falling into place in his mind, creating a picture he didn't want to see. Here's what we do, I said, moving back to my desk and pulling out a leather journal, not a computer. Never a computer, always analog when it came to real strategy. You get closer to the Whitmore family. You become invaluable to them. You gather intelligence on their operations, their finances, their relationships. You watch them. You listen. You document. For how long? Jonathan asked. As long as it takes, I said. A year, 2 years, 5 years if necessary. Patience is what separates the men who win from the men who don't. I stood and walked toward him, closing the distance between us until we were separated by only a few feet. Up close, I could see the fear in his eyes, but I could also see something else, a kind of steel forming. The understanding that his world had just irrevocably changed. If you're ready to do this, I told him quietly, we begin next month. We begin when you tell them you want to join the company. We begin when you put on the suit and walk into their office and pretend that everything is fine, that you love your wife, that you trust your father-in-law. We begin when you become someone they don't suspect. And if I'm not ready? Jonathan asked, though we both knew the answer. Now and then you go home, you forget this conversation happened, and you watch your life fall apart, while you wonder what could have been different. I extended my hand toward him, not as a gesture of warmth, but as a test. To see if he would take it. To see if he understood that everything we'd discussed in this room was already written. That he was either part of the story that was about to unfold, or he was just a bystander watching it happen to him. Jonathan looked at my hand for 5 seconds that felt like hours. Then he reached out and took it. I'm ready, he said. And in that moment, everything changed. Not the world, not fate. Just 2 men understanding that the life Jonathan had known was over, and a new one, darker, more calculated, more painful, was about to begin. Then we're committed, I said. From now until the end, we're committed to this. I released his hand and returned to my desk. Below us, the city continued its endless motion, completely unaware that 2 people on the 42nd floor had just set in motion a series of events that would reshape 3 families, destroy empires, and force 1 man to become something he never thought he'd have to be. 3 years is a long time to wait. 3 years is exactly how long I knew it would take. When I'd first discovered Victoria's infidelity, when I'd first understood the depth of the conspiracy that Edward and his daughter had constructed around my son, I'd calculated the timeline down to the month. Patience isn't something most people understand. Patience is the weapon that separates the men who win from the men who simply react. Jonathan started at Whitmore Industries on a Monday in September. I knew he would. Edward had called 3 weeks prior, extending the invitation, with just enough warmth to seem genuine, and just enough calculation to be transparent to anyone who knew what to look for. I knew because I'd anticipated it. I'd orchestrated it in my own way by ensuring that Jonathan's presence at Sterling Capital was just visible enough to be valuable to them. I was in my office when Jonathan walked into Whitmore that morning. Not physically present, I wasn't foolish enough to show my face near that building. But I was watching in the way that matters. I had people positioned. I had equipment in place. And most importantly, I had Jonathan, who understood exactly what he was walking into. Edward's greeting was exactly what I expected. "Jonathan, my boy, welcome to the family business." I could hear it through the feed later that afternoon. The warmth calculated to the exact degree required to establish false kinship. The possessiveness of someone who'd just acquired something valuable and wanted everyone to know it belonged to him. Victoria appeared within minutes. I'd predicted that too. She would need to establish her presence to demonstrate to Edward and the team that she'd brought Jonathan in, that the idea had been hers. The performance was flawless. I could hear the smile in her voice. "Daddy wants you to work with the best people in the company, to really understand how we operate at the highest level, the highest level." That phrase made me smile. They had no idea that my son was inside their operations specifically to understand how they operated, to learn their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses. They believed they were the ones with power in this situation. They were wrong. Jonathan integrated into the team seamlessly. I received the report by 2 p.m. He was in meetings. He was asking intelligent questions. He was positioning himself as eager, capable, trustworthy. Everything I'd taught him to be. By 5 p.m., he had access to files that would have taken most people weeks to obtain. By 6 p.m., he had the team's confidence. The evening date with Victoria fell apart exactly as I'd predicted it would. She canceled via text at 7:55 p.m. with some excuse about work. I could hear the relief in her voice when Jonathan called to check on her relief that he'd given her an out, that she didn't have to maintain the fiction any longer. There was piano music in the background of that call. I noted it. Music that shouldn't exist in an office at that hour. Music that suggested a very different location than the one she'd claimed to be at. I received the report about the gym encounter at 8:47 p.m. My operative, a woman I'd hired months earlier positioned in the gym next to Whitmore, had observed the interaction. A man approximately 35, fit, confident. Eyes that lingered on Victoria in a way that suggested familiarity, intimacy. The hand on her shoulder lasted just long enough to be more than casual, just long enough to confirm what I'd suspected for 18 months. Jonathan called me at 9:15 p.m. I saw them together, he said, without preamble. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the edges of something breaking underneath. Anger, betrayal, the weight of confirmation. I know, I said. I'd been waiting for this call. At the gym, Dad. There's a guy. The way he looked at her, the way she looked at him. Jonathan's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Document everything," I said quietly. "Every time you see something, every conversation, every moment that doesn't add up. We're going to need proof, Jonathan. Real proof. Not suspicions, not observations. Proof that would hold up in court. Proof that would convince a judge, a bank, or anyone else who needs to understand exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." "I understand," Jonathan said. I hung up and waited. By 11:30 p.m., I had the final confirmation. Victoria's Mercedes pulled up in front of a hotel on 52nd Street. She exited the vehicle, smoothed down her dress, and walked inside like she was coming home. Like that space, that transient rented space, meant more to her than the apartment she shared with my son. More than the family she'd constructed through lies. I didn't feel anger in that moment. I felt something sharper and cleaner. Certainty. Everything I'd planned for 3 years was already in motion. Every prediction I'd made was proving accurate. Jonathan was inside their organization exactly as I'd orchestrated. The evidence was mounting exactly as I'd anticipated. And the people responsible for creating this situation had no idea they were walking directly into the trap I'd been building since the moment I'd first discovered their betrayal. The infiltration had begun exactly on schedule, and from here forward, every move they made would push them closer to their own destruction. I was positioned outside the Whitmore building on a Tuesday morning in March. The weather was cold, the kind of cold that cuts through your coat and reminds you that you're alive in exactly the way that matters. I'd chosen this location carefully. The maintenance closet on the 4th floor, 3 doors down from Edward's office. No one would question my presence there. My company still had contracts with Whitmore's building management. My access was completely legitimate. The recording device was small enough to fit in my palm. Military-grade surveillance equipment, the kind that picks up whispered conversations from 60 feet away. The kind that captures not just words, but the emotional texture underneath them. I'd had it installed 12 hours earlier during the night shift, when the building was nearly empty. I knew Edward was going to call Jonathan into his office at 10 a.m. I knew it the same way I knew most things, because I'd anticipated it. Edward was becoming increasingly desperate. The $500,000 loan request had been forming in his mind for weeks. I'd had people watching his financial statements, tracking the pressure he was under. The companies he controlled were hemorrhaging money. His investments weren't yielding the returns he'd promised to his investors. And Victoria's situation, whatever arrangement she'd required, whatever legal protections she'd demanded for the child that wasn't Jonathan's, was draining capital that should have been invested elsewhere. Edward needed money, and he believed Jonathan was the key to getting it. At 9:58 a.m. I heard the intercom buzz. Jonathan was entering Edward's office. I could hear the door close the change in acoustics as the space became contained. Jonathan. Edward's voice came through the feed. I'd heard him use this tone before, warmth calculated to the exact degree necessary. I need your help with something. I adjusted the frequency on my receiver. Clarity increased. I could hear the rustle of papers. We have a business opportunity, Edward continued. It requires financing, some very specific financing. Well, how much are we talking about? Jonathan asked. His voice was perfectly modulated. Curious, but not suspicious. Interested, but not eager. I'd taught him well. $500,000, Edward said. The number hung in the air between them. Even through the recording device, I could feel the weight of it. We need your signature, Jonathan, Edward continued. We need you to facilitate this loan through your sterling capital connections. People you know. People who trust you. There was a pause. I could hear Victoria breathing. She was in the room too, though she hadn't spoken yet. What is this for? Jonathan asked. It was the perfect question. The question a man should ask before he signs a $500,000 loan document. The question that demonstrated he wasn't simply a puppet. A venture. Victoria's voice came through. Smooth. Practiced. An investment opportunity that requires discretion. You understand discretion, don't you, Jonathan? The implication was clear. We're family. Family doesn't ask too many questions. I could hear Jonathan processing this. Could hear the moment he'd decided to play along. Could hear the exact second when he understood that saying yes was the safest thing he could do. I can try to help, Jonathan said. That's all we need, Edward replied. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He believed he'd just successfully manipulated my son into becoming complicit in whatever scheme he was orchestrating. He had no idea that I could hear every word, that I was recording every moment, that the documents he was about to hand Jonathan were already documented by 3 separate surveillance angles. The paperwork is straightforward, Edward continued. Just routine business financing, nothing complicated, just a capital injection for a real estate development. The papers rustled. I could imagine them being laid out on Edward's desk. loan applications, business plans with vague descriptions designed to hide rather than illuminate, financial projections that looked professional but explained nothing about what the money would actually be used for. "Just sign here," Edward said. I heard the sound of a pen being picked up. I heard the scratch of ink on paper, Jonathan's signature. The moment he became legally entangled with Edward's scheme. The moment the evidence became concrete. "Perfect," Edward said. His voice carried genuine pleasure. "This stays between us, Jonathan. Just the three of us. Not your colleagues at Sterling. Not your friends. Not anyone." "Understood." "Understood," Jonathan said. The conversation ended moments later. I heard Jonathan leave, heard the door close behind him. Heard Edward's breathing shift into something that sounded like relief or victory. Edward had no idea that the moment he'd just experienced, the moment he believed he'd successfully pressured my son into signing fraudulent documents, was the moment he'd walked directly into the trap I'd been constructing for 3 years. He had no idea that every word he'd spoken had been captured by equipment that would hold up in court, that every document he'd presented would be photographed and catalogued, that the signature Jonathan had just placed on those papers was part of the evidence that would ultimately destroy him. Edward believed he'd won something. He believed he'd acquired leverage over Jonathan. He believed he'd successfully bought the compliance of my son. What Edward didn't understand was that he'd just provided me with exactly what I needed. Not to destroy him, that would come later. Not to arrest him, that was the government's job. But to prove irrefutably that Edward Whitmore was willing to commit fraud. That he was willing to manipulate. That he was willing to cross the line from legitimate business into criminal conspiracy. I packed up my recording equipment and left the maintenance closet. As I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I smiled. The first attack was complete, and we hadn't even reached the endgame yet. 3 months had passed since Jonathan signed away $500,000 that was never meant to exist. 3 months of watching Edward Whitmore grow more confident, more reckless. I'd grown accustomed to the waiting, to the precise choreography of it all. My device, state-of-the-art, embedded in a coffee maker that sat on a maintenance cart outside Edward's private conference room, had been humming quietly through every boardroom conversation. Victoria's voice clipped and refined. Edward's laughter, the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. And Jonathan, my son, performing a role so convincing that even I had to remind myself it was an act. The second trap was always going to be different, bigger, messier. $5 million doesn't materialize in signatures alone. It requires desperation, and desperation makes men careless. I received the call at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Jonathan's voice was flat professional, exactly as we'd practiced. "They want to see me again," he said. Nothing more. I already knew. My contacts at the bank had flagged Edward's inquiries 2 days prior. He was looking for collateral, for leverage, for ways to move money that shouldn't move. The third phase was beginning, whether he knew it or not. By 3:15 p.m., I was in position. The coffee maker had been serviced that morning. Fresh batteries, crystal clear audio. I sat in a vehicle 3 blocks away, a tablet on my lap, displaying the feed earbuds fitted so precisely that I could hear the whisper of Edward's breathing through the speaker system. Jonathan entered the conference room at 3:42 p.m. I heard the door close, the soft shuffle of bodies finding chairs. "Jonathan." Edward's voice carried that particular warmth reserved for family or prey. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Victoria and we have a significant opportunity." "Of course," Jonathan replied. His tone was perfect, eager, loyal, untainted by suspicion. "The previous arrangement," Edward continued, "was merely the beginning. We need more capital, a real estate venture in Chicago. Substantial returns, but it requires, let's say, a more substantial investment." I leaned forward, my fingers poised above the tablet. How much? Jonathan asked. 5 million, Victoria said. I could hear the smile in her voice. Predatory, practiced. There was a pause. Jonathan processing. That's a significant amount. Yes, Edward acknowledged. But your family at Sterling has those relationships, those connections. And you, my boy, you're in a position to access them in ways that others cannot. Another pause. The sound of papers being moved across mahogany. Legal documents, I assumed. Forged ones, if my intelligence was accurate. Jonathan. Edward's voice shifted. It became lower, more confidential, almost conspiratorial. Listen to me carefully. The situation with Victoria, it requires certain arrangements, specific measures. We cannot allow any trace, any evidence to surface. Do you understand? My jaw tightened. I glanced at the tablet, as if seeing the room through the speaker could somehow clarify what I already knew was coming. What situation, sir? Jonathan's voice was a masterpiece of innocent confusion. Edward hesitated. I could hear it in the silence, the calculation, the internal debate between caution and the need to explain. In the end, desperation won. The boy, Edward said quietly. We need to ensure he's handled appropriately. From a legal standpoint, naturally. Everything above board, but protected. The boy, Lucas. I stopped moving. My hand froze above the keyboard. Around me, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Horns, sirens, the ordinary violence of New York proceeding without knowledge of what I'd just heard. Edward seemed to realize his error immediately. I could hear it in the sharp intake of breath, the sudden shift in his posture. Forget I said that. He commanded, his voice hardening. Pretend this conversation never happened. Are we clear? Of course, Jonathan responded, but I could hear the tremor beneath the compliance. My son was sharp. He understood that something seismic had just shifted beneath the surface of our careful plan. So the documents are straightforward, Victoria interjected, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. 5 million, your connections. 1 week to secure preliminary approval. After that, the legal framework handles itself. I heard the papers being moved again, pens clicking. Jonathan's signature, I presumed, added to yet another layer of our architecture. By 4:19 p.m., the meeting was concluded. Jonathan's departure was marked by the soft close of the conference room door. I waited exactly 12 minutes before my phone buzzed. A text as planned, it's done. The audio feed continued through the afternoon. Edward's voice now heavy with something that might have been regret, or might have been fear, speaking to Victoria about contingencies, about lawyers, about the precarious balance they were attempting to maintain between ambition and exposure. I didn't move from my position until sunset painted the sky in shades of rust and gold. At 9:47 p.m., my encrypted line rang. Jonathan's number. Dad. His voice was different now. Not the careful performance, but something raw. Something shocked. What did he mean? What situation? The boy. Dad, he said the boy. Is Lucas? I didn't answer immediately. Some revelations require their moment. Some truths need to arrive not in haste, but in their proper sequence. Come to my office tomorrow morning, I said quietly. We have something to discuss, something that changes everything. The line went silent, except for Jonathan's breathing, rapid, confused, the sound of a man watching the foundation of his world crack open. When everything's about to become clear, son, I told him. But tonight you need to rest. Tomorrow you'll understand why we do this. I ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the distant hum of the city, the audio feed from Edward's office still playing in my ear. In the background, I could hear Victoria's voice, sharp, satisfied, utterly unaware that every word she spoke was being documented, preserved, weaponized. The second trap had been set. The evidence had been collected. and now the final phase of our reckoning could truly begin. Jonathan walked into my office at 8:47 a.m., and I could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He hadn't slept. I knew this because I hadn't expected him to. The question hanging in the dark is Lucas wasn't the kind that permitted rest. The DNA results sat centered on my desk untouched, since they'd arrived 3 days prior. I'd waited for this moment with the precision of a man who understands that timing transforms information into weaponry. "So sit down, son," I said quietly. He did, though his body remained rigid, poised on the edge of the chair, as if preparing for impact. Smart. He already sensed what was coming. 2 weeks ago, I began keeping my voice level. I had Lucas tested, blood work standard paternity panel, the kind of thing that takes 15 minutes to collect and 2 weeks to process in a lab nobody can trace. Jonathan's hands gripped the armrests. "Dad, that's not... The boy is not your son, Jonathan." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of a world suddenly reorganizing itself around a fact too large to immediately comprehend. I watched his chest rise and fall faster now, almost rhythmic in its desperation. I slid the envelope across the mahogany surface of my desk. He didn't reach for it immediately. His eyes fixed on it as though the paper itself might detonate. "Open it," I said. His hands shook as he extracted the documents. Laboratory letterhead. Official seals. The kind of clinical precision that leaves no room for doubt or debate. The DNA analysis was remarkably thorough. Genetic markers, aligned probability calculations displayed with mathematical certainty. Biological mother Victoria Whitmore, 99.97% probability. Biological father Nathan Cross, 99.97% probability. Relationship to Jonathan Harrison, not biologically related, 0% match. Jonathan's breathing became shallow. His eyes moved across the page again and again as if repetition might alter the data. Science, however, remains immobile in the face of denial. "How long have you known?" His voice was fractured, barely recognizable. "Long enough," I replied. "But I needed you to hear it from Edward first." The slip in his office 3 months ago. "The boy requires certain arrangements." That was the moment I confirmed my suspicions. But confirmation and proof are different things. This is proof. He set the papers down carefully, as though they might shatter. "What happens to Lucas?" "Lucas comes home with us," I said simply. "He stays with his family, his real family. Victoria lost any claim to him the moment she made him a pawn in their game. As for Edward, he'll face the consequences of every choice he made to protect his daughter's lies." "What about Nathan?" Jonathan's question came quietly, almost hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Nathan Cross has already agreed to be part of this plan," I said. There was no inflection in my voice, no judgment. Facts presented as facts. "He understands what's at stake. He understands that the boy his boy deserves better than parents who treat him as collateral." Jonathan stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the city continued its indifferent machinery. Millions of people moving through their days unaware that in this office on this morning, a man's entire conception of fatherhood had just been rewritten. "I raised him," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. 4 years. I changed his diapers. I taught him to walk. I read him bedtime stories. And you will continue to do exactly that." I interrupted, my voice cutting through his spiral with surgical precision. "You will continue to be his father because that's what a father is, Jonathan. It's not about biology. It's about sacrifice. It's about showing up every single day and choosing to love someone more than you love yourself. You've already done that. Victoria's infidelity doesn't erase a single moment of it." He turned back to face me. There were tears now moving silently down his cheeks. but his jaw had hardened. The shock was transforming into something else, something closer to clarity. This is why we do this. I continued leaning back in my chair. This is why we will win. Because everything Edward Whitmore has built, every dollar, every connection, every carefully cultivated relationship, it was all constructed on the foundation of lies, on the exploitation of his own family, on the weaponization of a child he doesn't even acknowledge. And when it all falls apart, Jonathan asked, but it falls apart. I said, because it was never real, and Lucas will be safe. With us. Protected by people who actually love him, not by people who trade him like a commodity. Jonathan nodded, slowly absorbing this architecture of purpose. I watched the transformation occur in real time, the move from devastation to determination, from victim to participant in something larger than himself. Phase 3 starts tomorrow. I said, my tone shifting into something harder, something final. Everything we've documented, the signatures, the recordings, Edward's own admissions, it all becomes active. From tomorrow forward, there are no more observations, no more passive intelligence gathering. We move into direct action. You mean attack 3, Jonathan said. It wasn't a question. I mean the financial trap that will force Edward into a corner so tight, he'll have no choice but to reveal himself completely. I confirmed. I mean the moment when his own desperation becomes his confession. Jonathan was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders, and when he looked at me again, I saw something I hadn't seen since he was a boy: absolute certainty. Absolute commitment. Are you ready? I asked him. Yes, he said simply. There was no hesitation in that single word, no reservation. Just the pure, crystalline clarity of a man who finally understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to dismantle the systems that prey on them. I nodded and gestured toward the door. Then we begin at dawn. He left my office with the DNA results still clutched in his hand. Evidence, yes, but also something more. A reminder of why this war had to be fought. A reminder that some betrayals run so deep that they require a reckoning. As he closed the door behind him, I returned my attention to the reports on my desk. The legal documents, the financial records, the photographs and recordings that documented every crime, every manipulation, every calculated step Edward and Victoria had taken to build their empire on stolen lives. Tomorrow we would begin the final phase. Tomorrow we would make them pay. Phase 3 began the moment Jonathan walked out of my office. By noon, the machinery was already in motion. I'd spent the previous night making calls not to anyone who could be traced, but to people who understood the value of discretion and the particular persuasiveness of money directed toward specific outcomes. A bank manager in Manhattan who owed me a favor from a decade prior. A compliance officer at Sterling Capital who'd been strategically positioned there years ago, waiting for exactly this moment. The pieces had been in place longer than Edward Whitmore realized. Sometimes the best traps are the ones laid so far in advance that the prey never sees the hunter until the jaws close. Edward called Jonathan at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. I heard the conversation through the encrypted feed. Jonathan wore a small device no larger than a watch face, transmitting every word directly to my secured server. Jonathan. Edward's voice carried that peculiar blend of confidence and desperation that only men with everything to lose can manage. I need you to do something for me. Something significant. Of course, sir, Jonathan replied. His tone was perfect, loyal, eager, untainted by knowledge. A real estate venture in Chicago. $8 million. Commercial property with strong returns. We need the capital within the week. I watched the transaction in real time, monitoring 3 separate screens, displaying bank records, communication logs, and the audio feed. Everything choreographed. Everything inevitable. $8 million is substantial, Jonathan said carefully. It is. Edward acknowledged. But your family at Sterling, they maintain relationships with institutional lenders, people who move money quickly, discreetly. I need you to activate those connections. There was a pause, Jonathan processing his lines. I can try, sir, but there are no limitations here, Jonathan. This is family. This is business. Use whatever resources you need, whatever you have to offer. Make it happen. By 3:47 p.m., I'd already set the second phase in motion. A call to the bank's compliance department. A carefully worded notification about suspicious activity on Sterling Capital accounts, the specific accounts Edward had flagged for potential collateral. Documentation suggesting irregularities, possible money laundering, offshore connections that didn't quite align with regulatory requirements. All of it fabricated naturally. But fabrication backed by enough technical detail and procedural accuracy to trigger the mandatory review protocols. Jonathan reported back to Edward at 5:22 p.m. I've made contact with the institutional lenders. They're prepared to move forward. Documentation will be ready by tomorrow morning. What Jonathan didn't say, because he couldn't say, it was that I'd already been inside those systems. Already positioned the rejection at the precise moment when Edward's confidence would peak. Already ensured that the forged documents would be the first thing the automated fraud detection system flagged. By 6:15 p.m., Edward's collateral accounts were frozen. By 7:03 p.m., the loan application had been formally denied. By 7:45 p.m., Edward Whitmore had discovered that $8 million doesn't exist simply because you've decided you need it. I was in my office when Jonathan called. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the satisfaction beneath the professional veneer. It didn't work, sir. The bank rejected the application. They're citing fraud concerns. They've frozen the accounts connected to Sterling Capital's collateral arrangements. How is that possible? Edward's voice came through the encrypted line, cracked and disbelieving. I have documentation, legal agreements, years of relationship capital with those institutions. I don't know, sir, Jonathan said, and his uncertainty was perfect because it was performed. But they're being very specific. They mentioned forged documents, regulatory violations. They want legal counsel involved before proceeding. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4.7 seconds. I counted. Then Edward's voice returned, but it was different now. The smooth confidence had fractured. What emerged was raw fury. What the hell happened, Jonathan? What did you do? I did exactly what you asked, sir. I contacted the lenders. I presented the opportunity. They accepted, and then nothing. And then the entire transaction collapses. Someone sabotaged this, Jonathan. Someone knew about this deal and deliberately ensured it would fail. I leaned back in my chair and watched the real-time data cascade across my screens. Bank records updating, compliance notifications flowing through regulatory channels, offshore account flags being raised by automated systems that would eventually catch the attention of people far more powerful than any bank manager. Phase 3 was complete. I dismantled his empire's financial infrastructure with a single coordinated move. Not through violence or drama, but through the precise exploitation of systems already designed to protect themselves. The machinery of capitalism, once redirected, becomes an unstoppable instrument of destruction. Edward's personal phone rang at 8:47 p.m. I listened as he answered, his voice tentative, already damaged by the day's events. Yes. Mr. Whitmore, this is FBI Director Brennan with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've been monitoring your offshore accounts for approximately 4 months. We have questions regarding the movement of capital that appears to violate several regulatory statutes. We'll need you to come in for a formal interview. I watched Jonathan's face through the security camera feed, the careful neutrality, the absolute absence of surprise. He'd known this was coming. Had accepted it 3 hours ago when he'd committed to Phase 3. Edward's face went pale. His hand gripped the desk so tightly his knuckles went white. What are you talking about? He said one time. My accounts are... completely above board, the FBI agent asked, and there was something almost amused in the agent's tone. We'll discuss that at our offices. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., bring your attorney. The line went dead. Edward stood motionless for several seconds, the phone still pressed against his ear. Then he set it down with the careful deliberation of a man who'd suddenly realized that the ground beneath him had become quicksand. I stood as well, walking to my office window and looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city continued its evening transition lights flickering on traffic, flowing millions of people moving through their lives entirely unaware of the precise moment when one man's world had fundamentally reorganized itself. Tomorrow, gala preparations would accelerate. Nathan would be positioned. The final stage would be choreographed down to the second. But tonight, Edward Whitmore sat in his office understanding, for perhaps the first time, that the trap wasn't coming. He was already inside it, and the walls were closing in. 2 weeks of preparation had crystallized into this single afternoon. I stood in my office with Jonathan and Nathan the first time the three of us occupied the same space, the first moment when the invisible threads connecting our separate operations became visible architecture. The Whitmore family is hosting a charity gala this Friday, I said, keeping my voice level. Black tie, prominent guests, media presence outside the ballroom. It's perfect. Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding the implication without needing me to spell it out. Nathan remained silent, observing, already calculating the technical requirements. What happens at the gala? Jonathan asked. They walk into that ballroom, I replied. Everything else, absolutely everything, we control. Nathan stepped forward, his demeanor businesslike and precise. I've established multiple video feed sources throughout the venue. Security cameras, independent feeds, backup systems. Everything will be live streamed to a secure server. When the moment arrives, we can broadcast to the main display system simultaneously. I watched Jonathan process this. He understood enough to know that technology would play a central role, but the specifics remained deliberately vague. In this operation, compartmentalization was survival. The door opened without a knock, the privilege of people accustomed to moving through powerful spaces. Patricia Morrison entered, first followed by Robert Sinclair. Both carried leather portfolios that seemed to contain the weight of legal authority. Behind them came James Morrison, my head of security, moving with the economical precision of someone who'd spent decades protecting valuable things. The documentation is prepared, Patricia said, setting her portfolio on my desk. Every legal mechanism, every regulatory framework, everything the FBI will need. FBI is standing by, Robert added. They're waiting for authorization. Once we confirm the operation is underway, they move on their timeline. I nodded. The coordination had been months in the making, careful conversations through intermediaries, strategic relationships with federal prosecutors who understood that some crimes required witnessing, the kind of crimes that needed to be seen to be prosecuted effectively. James, I turned to my security chief. The logistics. The car will be here at 7 p.m., he confirmed. Unmarked. Driver cleared. We'll take the northern route to avoid evening traffic. Arrival at the venue by 7:45. That gives us 15 minutes before Edward traditionally makes his appearance. I retrieved the suit from the closet, the one I'd had prepared weeks earlier, every detail considered. I handed it to Jonathan. Put on this suit, I said. I've prepared it for you. Everything we need is inside. Jonathan took the suit carefully, his fingers tracing the fabric. He understood without being told that this garment carried more than threads and wool. Inside the jacket, lining a microphone nearly invisible, utterly reliable. Inside the left cuff, a small panic button connected to Nathan's network. If things went wrong, if Edward became violent or unpredictable, one press, and the FBI would enter within seconds. "Everything we need," I repeated, watching his face. "It will protect you, it will record them, and it will do exactly what we need it to do." "Walk me through it," I said to the assembled group. "The sequence. I want every moment accounted for." Nathan began. "Video feeds go live at 7:55 p.m. Backup systems confirm signal at 8 o'clock. By 8:15 we have complete coverage of the ballroom." Patricia continued. "Legal warrants are signed. Charges are prepared. The moment we confirm Edward and Victoria's presence in the ballroom, we execute," Robert finished. "Documentation arrests, everything happens in sequence. There's no opportunity for them to flee. There's no moment for improvisation." I looked at each of them in turn. These were professionals, lawyers who understood justice, security officers who'd protected critical assets, a man who simply wanted his son to know the truth. We were unified not by common backgrounds or shared history, but by singular purpose. "Jonathan," I said, my tone shifting. "Go see Lucas. Spend time with him tonight. Tomorrow will be different for him. He needs to know his father loves him regardless of what changes." Jonathan nodded and left my office. I watched him go, understanding the weight he carried. By evening, Jonathan had taken Lucas to their apartment. I tracked the movement through my security feeds, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Surveillance becomes a language when you speak it long enough. Jonathan prepared Lucas for bed, and I heard the conversation through the discreet audio I'd placed in their living space. "Dice, we're going to a party tomorrow night, buddy," Jonathan said softly. "A party." Lucas's voice was small, innocent, filled with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 4-year-old. "A very fancy party," Jonathan confirmed. "You'll meet a lot of people. There will be music and lights." "Will Mommy be there?" Jonathan paused. I could hear him breathing, could sense the precise moment when he made peace with what comes next. "Yes, Mommy will be there. And everything will change. But you'll be safe. I promise you that." Lucas didn't fully understand. How could he, but children, sense absolute conviction the way animals sense weather shifts? He was satisfied by the certainty in his father's voice. By midnight, our operation had reached its final staging point. 8 FBI special agents sat in unmarked vehicles positioned strategically around the route to the gala venue. They'd been briefed on the operation, but not the full-scope compartmentalization. Again, the art of ensuring that if something broke, it broke cleanly. Patricia and Robert reviewed the paperwork one final time in my office. Everything was legally ironclad, every document prepared, every contingency addressed. This wasn't going to be a messy public accusation or a sensational scandal. This was going to be a carefully orchestrated dismantling executed with such precision that no one could claim it was anything other than justice. Nathan conducted final tests on all video feed systems. Backup confirmed, encryption verified, fail-safes in place. By 2 a.m., he texted me a single word: ready. I stood at my office window and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. The city sprawled beneath me, indifferent to the machinery we'd constructed. Millions of people sleeping unaware that in approximately 18 hours, something fundamental would shift. A reckoning would begin. In the early morning hours before dawn, Edward Whitmore was preparing to walk into a ballroom that would become his confession. I'd designed it so perfectly that he wouldn't even realize he was walking toward his own destruction until the moment the walls closed in. The gala would be his final performance. After Friday night, there would be no more acts for Edward Whitmore, no more speeches, no more carefully constructed illusions, just reckoning. And I would be watching every second of it unfold. The ballroom was a study in calculated elegance. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across mahogany tables dressed in pristine white linen. 200 prominent faces, CEOs, politicians, society figures, filled the space with the particular energy of people who believed themselves untouchable. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays. A string quartet played in the corner, their music a gentle underscore to the evening's carefully orchestrated performance. Edward Whitmore stood on the raised platform tuxedo, tailored to perfection, every inch the patriarch of an empire. His hair had been darkened for the occasion, his teeth brightened by expensive cosmetic work. When he approached the podium, the crowd rose in collective applause, a gesture of respect earned through decades of strategic philanthropy and calculated benevolence. I watched from my position near the bar, champagne untouched in my hand. Nathan had positioned himself near the main electrical panel. Patricia and Robert sat at separate tables, their laptops discreetly monitoring the system feeds. James stood near the service entrance, coordinating with the 8 FBI agents positioned outside in unmarked vehicles. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. Edward tapped the microphone and the crowd settled into attentive silence. "Good evening." He began, his voice carrying the refined confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Tonight, we gather to honor the success of Whitmore Industries, and more importantly, the bonds of family that make such success possible. In this world of transaction and ambition, it is family that provides our foundation. Family that—" I raised my hand. The signal was subtle, but it was enough. Every display screen in the ballroom simultaneously went dark. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. Waiters froze. The crowd's attention shifted from Edward to the massive video walls surrounding the space walls that had displayed elegant imagery just seconds before. Now they were blank, black, expectant. Edward's confidence flickered. "Technical difficulty," he said with forced laughter. "It seems—" The screens blazed to life. The image was Victoria, but not the Victoria of the ballroom. This was Victoria from 3 months ago, recorded in a lawyer's office with a camera positioned so carefully that only her face and shoulders were visible. Her expression was hollowed by the weight of confession. "I lied to Jonathan about Lucas." Her recorded voice filled the ballroom. "I had an affair. Nathan Cross is the boy's biological father, not Jonathan. I let Jonathan raise a child that wasn't his while I—" The crowd's reaction was instantaneous. Gasps, hands covering mouths, whispers that escalated into audible conversation. A woman stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble. A man shook his head in disbelief. Edward moved toward the video controls, his face flushed. "Stop that!" he shouted. "Stop it immediately!" But the video continued. Now Edward's own voice filled the ballroom, his recorded confession from 3 months prior, captured through the encrypted microphone Jonathan had worn at the Whitmore office. "Shot to see. The boy requires certain arrangements," his recorded self said. "We need to ensure he's handled appropriately from a legal standpoint. We cannot leave any traces of this situation, any evidence that might complicate things. Do you understand? Everything must be organized, protected." Edward's face went pale. Not pale, drained. All color evacuated like water from a punctured vessel. His hand gripped the podium so tightly, I could see his knuckles go white from across the room. "Stop it now," he screamed, moving toward the nearest screen, as though he could physically attack the technology that was destroying him. Security personnel rushed toward the electrical panel, toward the switches that controlled the display system. But James had anticipated this. My team, positioned strategically throughout the ballroom, blocked every approach. One security guard attempted to push past was redirected with professional courtesy. Another tried to reach the emergency shutoff. Stopped. The videos continued. The confessions played on. The crowd was no longer gasping. They were silent now, a deeper, more dangerous silence. The silence of people watching their assumptions about the world reorganize in real time. Victoria stood frozen at her table, finally comprehending the precision of her own exposure. Her hand trembled. Her companion looked at her with an expression that shifted from confusion to accusation in less than a second. I set down my champagne glass and stood. The movement caught attention immediately, not because I was important, but because I was deliberate. Head raised, shoulders back, eyes forward. Every person in that ballroom felt the shift in authority. Heads turned, hundreds of them. 200 pairs of eyes moved from the screens displaying Edward's recorded voice to the figure rising from the crowd. She said, "I am Richard Harrison." I said simply, my voice carrying without needing the microphone. "And I'm here to tell you the truth about this family." The silence deepened. Edward looked at me, and for the first time I saw something break behind his eyes. Recognition. Realization. Understanding that this wasn't a technical failure or a random attack. This was orchestration. This was strategy. This was reckoning. Now my son worked for Whitmore Industries. I continued moving toward the center of the ballroom, where every line of sight converged. He married into this family, and in doing so he discovered something that should have remained hidden, a web of deception, exploitation, and the weaponization of a child. Tonight you are witnessing the moment when that web becomes visible. The videos played on. Edward's confession cycled again. Victoria's anguished admission of betrayal filled the space once more. I did not move. I simply stood there, allowing the weight of presence to settle over the room. Behind me, I could sense the movement of law enforcement, the careful positioning, the preparation for what came next. But first, the truth had to be witnessed. First, these people had to understand that the empire they'd been celebrating was built entirely on foundation of lies. Everything you see tonight, I said, everything you hear, it's being recorded, it's being witnessed, and it's no longer deniable. Edward Whitmore sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him with the inevitability of physics. The confessions continued to play, and the reckoning finally had begun. If you're still with me, comment 1 right now. Before we continue, what comes next includes dramatized elements based on real events. Some details have been changed for privacy and storytelling purposes. If you only want pure facts, you can stop here. But if you want to see justice unfold through a powerful narrative, stay with me. I stood on the stage, the ballroom transformed into something between a courtroom and a confessional. The silence was absolute. Edward sat frozen at his table, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Victoria had stopped pretending, her face had gone slack with the dawning realization that escape was impossible. The crowd watched, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on me with the intensity of people bearing witness to something they would spend years trying to understand. 3 years ago, I began my voice steady and deliberate. I discovered that my son was being systematically manipulated by the people he trusted most. His wife, her father, a conspiracy built on lies and escalating financial predation. The screens behind me flickered to life with new images. DNA test results appeared stark and clinical. Laboratory letterhead, genetic markers aligned in scientific precision. The results were unambiguous. Lucas Harrison's biological mother was Victoria Whitmore, 97% probability. His biological father was Nathan Cross, 99.97% probability. Jonathan Harrison showed zero genetic relationship to the child he'd raised for 4 years. 0% match. The crowd's reaction rippled through the room, not gasps now, but understanding. This explained everything. The affair, the deception, the financial urgency that had driven 3 separate attacks on my son's loyalty. This child, I continued gesturing toward the screen, became the instrument of a larger conspiracy, a tool for accessing resources that didn't belong to them. The screens shifted again. Loan documents appeared displayed side by side for comparison. 3 separate applications. 3 escalating amounts. Attack 1, $500,000 for an unspecified venture. Edward Whitmore's signature on the application, or what appeared to be his signature. Attack 2, $5 million for a Chicago real estate project. The same signature reproduced again. Attack 3, $8 million for residential development. Edward's name on the documents once more. These are forged, I said flatly. Not the signatures themselves, those are genuine, but the documents containing them were constructed with false information, false collateral claims, and false representations of the fund's intended use. The crowd leaned forward. Some pulled out phones, lawyers, executives, people accustomed to recognizing fraud when they saw it spelled out in evidence form. A forensic comparison appeared on the screen. Edward's authentic signature from legitimate Whitmore Industries documents placed beside the signatures on these false applications. Even to an untrained eye, the deterioration was visible. The third signature showed obvious signs of mechanical reproduction, the pressure inconsistent, the ink distribution uneven. Edward Whitmore, I said, turning to look directly at him, and Victoria Whitmore constructed a pattern of systematic fraud. They escalated their demands. They attempted to access capital through increasingly elaborate schemes, and when those financial traps weren't sufficient, they began to address what they called the Lucas problem, a child's existence that required what Edward termed legal handling. Edward stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward. This is slander. This is documented evidence. I interrupted, my voice cutting through his attempted denial like a blade. Witnessed by 200 people, recorded by authorities, and about to be prosecuted by the full force of federal law. The FBI agents moved into the ballroom with practiced efficiency. They'd been positioned near the exits, waiting for exactly this moment. 3 agents approached Edward's table. Another pair moved toward Victoria, who had begun backing away, searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. Victoria made her move. She pivoted toward the service entrance, attempting to move quickly through the kitchen area where fewer witnesses would see her flight. But James had anticipated this. My security team blocked the kitchen exit. Victoria froze, understanding in that precise moment that every avenue of escape had been deliberately sealed. Patricia Morrison stood, her lawyer's bearing unmistakable. Edward Whitmore. She announced, her voice formal and official. You are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The handcuffs were applied with professional courtesy. Edward didn't resist. Resistance would have been pointless at this stage. His empire had collapsed in less than 20 minutes. His carefully constructed reputation had been systematically dismantled through video evidence, documentary proof, and the testimony of 200 prominent witnesses. Victoria's arrest followed immediately after. As she was led away, her composure finally shattered. She reached toward the crowd with a gesture that was almost reflexive, a plea for help that would never come. Her companions, the society figures who'd claimed friendship, simply watched her pass with the neutral expressions of people observing a stranger's misfortune. Nathan Cross stepped forward, and the crowd seemed to notice him for the first time. He moved to Jonathan's side, his hand settling on Lucas's shoulder, a gesture of paternal claim that was impossible to misinterpret. For the first time publicly and undeniably, Nathan acknowledged the boy as his own. He looked directly at Jonathan, and in that glance was recognition of shared sacrifice. Jonathan had raised Lucas. Nathan was Lucas's biological father. Both men bound by something that transcended genetics, the determination to protect a child from the predatory architecture his own family had constructed around him. The ballroom's energy had shifted completely. What had begun as scandal had transformed into something more profound, the visible machinery of justice executing itself in real time. I descended from the stage and moved through the crowd toward the service area where I'd arranged to meet with federal leadership. Within moments, FBI Director Thomas Brennan appeared, his presence commanding immediate respect. He was a man accustomed to authority, which meant he recognized it in others. "Mr. Harrison," he said, extending his hand, "your cooperation has been invaluable. The coordination between your operation and our investigation has yielded results that exceed our initial projections." I shook his hand, understanding the deeper implication of his words. This wasn't simply about Edward and Victoria Whitmore. "We're expanding the investigation into Whitmore Industries' broader financial operations," he continued. "The scale of potential violations is larger than we initially understood. Your continued assistance would be crucial to ensuring that every component of this conspiracy is properly addressed." I nodded, accepting the implicit understanding that this wasn't over. This was merely the first phase of a much larger reckoning. "Whatever you need," I said simply. The director smiled, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of a man watching systemic corruption being systematically dismantled. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Harrison. There's still significant work ahead." He turned and moved back toward the ballroom, where his agents continued their methodical processing of the scene. Edward and Victoria had been removed. The crowd was being politely but firmly directed toward providing statements. The media outside was going to have a field day with this story, a charity gala that transformed into a federal prosecution. The narrative was irresistible. I stood in the shadows near the service area, watching the machinery of justice execute with the precision I'd orchestrated. 3 years of planning, 3 years of patience, and in one evening everything had been exposed, documented, and prosecuted. The reckoning was no longer theoretical. It was law. Victoria was led out of the ballroom in handcuffs, FBI agents flanking her with the professional indifference of people who'd done this countless times before. Her dress, the expensive gown she'd worn with such confidence just hours earlier, now seemed pathetic. A costume from a performance that had ended badly. The cool night air hit her face as she was guided toward the waiting vehicles. For a moment she seemed to regain some composure, as though the darkness outside might offer some kind of sanctuary from the truth. Then she saw them. Jonathan stood with Lucas, the boy's small frame pressed against his side. Nathan stood slightly behind them, a silent witness to the structure of family that had been forged through crisis. When Victoria's eyes locked on Lucas, something inside her broke completely. "Huh, Lucas?" She cried out, her voice fracturing. "Lucas, sweetheart, it's Mommy." The child turned toward her voice, and for a moment, I wondered if some biological connection might override everything else. If despite everything, some primal bond might reassert itself. Lucas looked at his mother, really looked at her, and took a step closer to Jonathan instead of toward her. His small hand gripped Jonathan's more tightly. "Oh, you're scary," Lucas said simply. The words were delivered with the perfect clarity that only children possess. Not cruel, not sophisticated, simply true. This woman who had constructed an entire conspiracy around his existence was now a source of fear rather than comfort. The biological connection, meant nothing against the emotional reality that Jonathan had been the one to show up. Jonathan had been the one to protect him. Victoria made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a plea and a scream. She tried to move toward them, but the FBI agents tightened their grip. "No," she cried. "No, that's not Lucas, baby. I'm your mother. You need me. You did what you chose to do, Victoria." I said, my voice cutting through her desperation with the clarity of absolute truth. "Not what Edward forced you to do. Your choice." She rounded on me, her face contorted. "This isn't fair, Edward. He made me do this. He said if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't keep Lucas, Edward didn't force you to deceive Jonathan about paternity." I continued, my tone remaining level. "Edward didn't force you to engineer a financial conspiracy. Edward didn't force you to use a 4-year-old as collateral in a criminal scheme. Those were your choices, Victoria. Own them." She opened her mouth, closed it. For just a moment, she seemed to consider actually accepting responsibility for what she'd done. The moment passed. "Jonathan," she cried instead desperately. "Jonathan, please, I'm sorry Lucas needs me. Please don't take him from me." Jonathan didn't respond. He simply held Lucas closer, his jaw set, his eyes fixed forward. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he'd even heard her. The silence was more devastating than any words could have been. Lucas, sensing Jonathan's resolve, stopped crying. The child reached up and wrapped his arms around Jonathan's neck, burying his face against his father's shoulder. Not his biological father, his real father. The one who'd shown up, the one who'd loved him enough to orchestrate an entire reckoning just to keep him safe. "Let's go," an FBI agent said quietly to Victoria, not unkindly. "It's time." "Chano," Victoria whispered. "No, wait, Jonathan." But Jonathan was already turning away, Lucas still in his arms. Nathan placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that was visible to everyone still watching. 3 men, 2 biological, 2 emotional, all united in their commitment to one child's safety. Victoria was guided toward the vehicle. She continued to reach backward, her hand extending toward Lucas, even as the distance increased. Her composure had completely shattered now. What remained was pure desperation, the realization that her world had been irrevocably altered and that she'd built it all herself. The car door opened. Victoria paused for one final moment, looking back at Lucas. "Lucas," she called out. "Baby, I love you. I'll come back for you. I promise." But the FBI agent was already placing his hand on her head, gently guiding her into the vehicle. The door closed with finality. Through the window, I could see her face distorted by anguish, finally understanding that some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. The vehicle began to move, its taillights disappearing into the night. Jonathan stood perfectly still for a moment, Lucas still in his arms. Then very quietly, he leaned down and whispered into the boy's ear. "Let's go home, buddy," he said softly. "We're going home, forever." Lucas nodded against his shoulder, too young to fully understand what had transpired, but old enough to comprehend that he was safe. That the uncertainty was over. That the man holding him was the only mother and father he would ever need. Nathan stepped alongside them, and together they began walking toward the waiting car. Behind them, Victoria's vehicle had already disappeared into the darkness. The ballroom was being processed by federal agents. The crowd was providing statements. But in this moment, separated from all of it, a family had been formed in the only way that truly mattered. Not through biology, through sacrifice, through showing up, through love that had been tested and had not wavered. The reckoning had destroyed those who'd built their world on deception, but it had saved the one who mattered most. The limousine moved smoothly through the Manhattan streets, the city's pulse reduced to streetlights and shadows passing the tinted windows. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my mind calculating timelines and legal strategies, and the 1,000 variables that comprised the next phase of our operation. Behind me in the back seat, Jonathan sat with Lucas asleep on his lap, the boy's small form finally at peace after everything he'd been forced to endure. Nathan sat in the passenger seat beside me, his eyes focused on the city passing outside. For several minutes, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the gentle breathing of a child who'd finally mercifully stopped being afraid. "Thank you, sir," Nathan said quietly, still looking out the window. "For trusting me." I glanced over at him briefly. "You're Lucas's father. You deserve to know the boy, to be part of his life if Jonathan and I have any say in it." Nathan turned to look at me then, and I saw something shift in his expression, the visible moment when a man accepts that he wasn't going to be kept on the periphery anymore, that his biological connection to the child meant something, that he mattered. "What happens now, Dad?" Jonathan's voice came from the back seat. The fact that he called me Dad in this moment told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. Not questioning whether I was still worthy of that title, but asking for direction, asking for the next steps. "Courting," I said simply. "Custody hearings. Then we restructure." "Restructure what?" Jonathan asked. "Everything," I said. "Whitmore Industries first. The legal apparatus surrounding it. The business itself. We're going to dismantle the predatory infrastructure Edward and Victoria built and replace it with something that actually serves the people it claims to." Nathan shifted in his seat. "What role do I have in this? I mean, I want to help. I want to be part of his life, if everyone agrees. But I want to know where I stand." It was the right question, the honest question, the question of a man who understood that he was entering into something that required clarity. Jonathan spoke before I could. "You're Lucas's father. You chose to be there when it mattered. Lucas deserves a father who chose him." There was a note of hard-won wisdom in his voice, the wisdom of a man who'd been forced to confront the difference between biology and love. "You're in. You're part of this family, however we need to define that." Nathan nodded slowly, accepting the terms. "Okay. Then I want to be there for everything. The court hearings, the aftermath, all of it." "You will be," I said. "Nathan, you were part of this operation from the beginning. You understood what we were trying to accomplish. That doesn't change now." The conversation shifted as we moved through the city. Jonathan asked about timelines, about what would happen with Whitmore Industries, about the practical mechanics of restructuring a multi-billion-dollar corporation in the aftermath of criminal prosecution. I explained the framework, the legal separation of assets, the removal of Edward and Victoria from all decision-making capacity, the systematic dismantling of the schemes they'd constructed. Then Jonathan asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What about you, Dad? What's your role in all this?" I was quiet for a moment, letting the city move past us. "I'm going public," I said finally. "My story's too large to hide anymore. The media's going to dig into this regardless of what we do. The FBI investigation is expanding. My involvement in the operation will become known. So I'm going to control the narrative instead of letting it control me." "What does that mean exactly?" Jonathan asked. "It means interviews. It means public statements. It means standing in front of cameras and explaining why I did what I did. It means accepting the scrutiny that comes with orchestrating something this large. It means no more shadows." Nathan turned to look at me. "Are you ready for that? Public exposure is different from operating behind the scenes." "I'm aware," I said. "But the work I've done, the work we've done, needs to have a human face. It needs to have accountability. I can't ask the courts to hold Edward and Victoria accountable while I hide behind anonymity. That's not justice. That's just revenge masquerading as righteousness." We drove in silence for a while, after that each of us processing what came next. The limousine carved through Manhattan's arteries, moving toward my residence in the upper reaches of the city. Jonathan shifted slightly, careful not to wake Lucas, who slept on, with the absolute trust only children possess. "I have something else to tell you," I said, as we approached the final stretch of our journey. "Jonathan, you're going to be CEO of Whitmore Industries. After the restructuring is complete, after the courts have made their determinations, you're going to take control of that company." Jonathan's silence in the back seat was profound. "Me," he finally managed. "Dad, I don't have the experience." "You have something more important," I interrupted. "You have integrity. You have the experience of being used by predatory systems and surviving it. You understand what it means to rebuild. And you'll have advisors, good people who understand business and understand justice." "But what about you?" Jonathan asked again. "Why me and not you?" "Because," I said, "I'm going to be busy doing something else. I'm going to be the public face of this reckoning. I'm going to sit for interviews and explain how a man orchestrates taking down a criminal empire. I'm going to answer questions about my methods and my motivations. I'm going to accept the scrutiny and the criticism and the inevitable attempts to portray this as something it wasn't." Nathan spoke quietly. "That's a lot to take on. The media will be merciless." I know," I said, "but it needs to happen. The alternative is letting predators hide behind the claim that they're just businessmen. The alternative is allowing systems of corruption to persist because calling them out seems too disruptive. I'm done with that version of the world." We arrived at the Harrison residence just before 11 p.m. The gates opened at my approach, and the limousine glided into the circular driveway. I cut the engine and sat for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. Lucas was still asleep on Jonathan's lap, one small hand curled against his father's chest. The rise and fall of his breathing was the only sound for a moment, the sound of a child who'd finally stopped being afraid. Nathan climbed out of the vehicle and opened the rear door for Jonathan, who carefully extracted himself without waking the boy. Together, the three of us, two fathers and one grandfather, carried a sleeping child toward the house that would now become a sanctuary for a new kind of family. Not the family Victoria and Edward had constructed through deception, but something real, something built on choice and commitment and the willingness to show up. I watched Jonathan carry Lucas toward the guest quarters we'd prepared, Nathan walking beside them, with his hand briefly touching Lucas's sleeping shoulder, a gesture that encompassed everything: acknowledgement, protection, love, and the promise of a different future. "How do tomorrow?" I said quietly to myself, standing alone in the entrance hall of my residence. The legal battles begin in earnest. The courts will hear arguments. The prosecution will build its case. The media will descend like carrion birds on a carcass. I paused, looking up the grand staircase toward where my son was putting his child, my grandchild, to bed. But tonight, I continued allowing myself something I rarely permitted: rest. The courtroom was austere and formal, all polished mahogany and institutional weight. 2 weeks had passed since the gala. Now we would have our answer. I sat behind Jonathan, who occupied the plaintiff's table with Patricia Morrison beside him. Nathan sat 3 rows back, his presence deliberate and acknowledged. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. The judge entered at precisely 11 a.m., and the courtroom rose with choreographed deference. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The matter of custody for Lucas Harrison, with Jonathan Harrison as petitioner and Edward Whitmore as respondent." Edward sat at the opposing table, his earlier confidence completely eroded. His lawyer looked as though he'd already accepted defeat. Patricia stood and presented the case with precision. The DNA results displayed on courtroom screens: Lucas Harrison's genetic profile, Victoria Whitmore as biological mother, 99.97% probability; Nathan Cross as biological father, 99.97% probability; Jonathan Harrison showing zero genetic relationship. The recordings came next. Victoria's voice confessing to the affair. Edward's voice recorded in his office. The boy requires certain arrangements. We need to ensure he's handled appropriately from a legal standpoint. Forged documents appeared on screen, 3 loan applications with Edward's signature, the third, so obviously falsified that even untrained eyes could see the fraud. Patricia's closing argument was brutal in its simplicity. Lucas Harrison requires a stable, loving parent who has demonstrated 3 years of dedicated care and protection. Jonathan Harrison is that parent. Edward Whitmore has engaged in fraud, conspiracy, and exploitation of a child. The choice is clear. Edward's lawyer offered a weak denial. The judge looked at him with the expression of a man who'd heard such protests countless times. "Mr. Whitmore, you wish to address the court." Edward stood. For a moment I thought he might accept the inevitable with grace. He didn't. "And this is a conspiracy," he said, his voice rising. "My son-in-law orchestrated this entire situation. The recordings are fabricated. The documents are forged." The judge made a note. "Based on the evidence presented and the best interest of the child, this court grants full custody of Lucas Harrison to Jonathan Harrison effective immediately." Edward's face went white. Victoria Whitmore's visitation rights are suspended pending the outcome of her criminal trial. Any contact with the child will be supervised and limited." The gavel came down. "Furthermore, Mr. Whitmore, this court has reviewed the conspiracy charges filed by federal prosecutors. Those charges appear substantial and well documented." Edward's lawyer began whispering urgently to his client. "This court is adjourned," the judge said, and stood to leave. For approximately 30 seconds, there was silence. The kind of silence that follows when the machinery of justice has spoken with absolute clarity. Then the courtroom doors opened and federal agents entered. Skirk Whitmore. One of them said, approaching the defendant's table, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The handcuffs were applied with practiced efficiency. Edward didn't resist. Everything he'd constructed had collapsed. He was led away without ceremony. Outside the courthouse, media surrounded us. News vans lined the street. Cameras and microphones created a forest of technology designed to capture every word. I stood with Jonathan Lucas between us while Nathan positioned himself slightly to the side, close enough to be included, far enough to avoid overwhelming the child. "We did it," Nathan said quietly to Jonathan. "You saved him." Jonathan shook his head. "We did it together." A reporter approached. Microphone extended. "Mr. Harrison, how does it feel to have custody of Lucas?" Before Jonathan could answer, I stepped forward. The cameras shifted toward me. "I'm Richard Harrison," I said simply. "Jonathan's father. What happened here today is justice. What happened at the gala 2 weeks ago was the exposure of systematic corruption. What's happening now is the restructuring of an organization built on lies." Another reporter. "What about Whitmore Industries?" "Sterling Capital is implementing a complete restructuring of Whitmore Industries," I said. "All assets held by Edward and Victoria are being frozen pending litigation. The company will be reconstructed with new leadership, new practices, and new commitment to transparency and accountability." An FBI vehicle pulled up. FBI Director Thomas Brennan stepped out and approached the courthouse steps. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation is expanding its investigation into Edward Whitmore's financial operations," he announced. "We have identified additional offshore accounts, suspicious wire transfers, and potential involvement in money laundering schemes that extend beyond the immediate family. This investigation will continue, and we anticipate additional charges in the coming weeks. The director turned to me. The cooperation of Mr. Richard Harrison and his family has been instrumental in uncovering the scope of these crimes. Their willingness to work with law enforcement has been invaluable. More cameras flashed. More questions were shouted. But the essential narrative was clear: justice had been served. The system had worked. The child was safe. I looked at Jonathan Lucas's hand in his and saw what I'd been working toward for 3 years: peace, security. The knowledge that a child would grow up in safety, protected by people who loved him, not by deception, but by authentic commitment. Nathan stood nearby, his role in Lucas's life no longer peripheral. 3 men bound together not by blood, but by the willingness to do what was right. That night, news reports would lead with the same headline across every major outlet: "The Whitmore dynasty collapses amid massive fraud investigation." Beneath it, photographs of Edward being led away in handcuffs. Victoria's name associated with conspiracy charges. Richard Harrison giving his statement steady and resolved. And in the corner of most reports, an image of Jonathan holding Lucas Nathan standing nearby, all 3 of them finally genuinely at peace. The Harrison residence felt different now, lighter somehow. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and I watched Lucas chase a toy truck across the marble floor, his laughter filling the space in a way that silence once had. 3 months. That's all it took for the boy to shed the wariness he'd carried like armor, for him to remember how to play. Jonathan sat across from me at the breakfast table, coffee in hand, wearing a navy suit with understated confidence. He looked like what he'd become, a CEO, though the ease in his posture told me the weight hadn't crushed him yet. Nathan stood near the sideboard, helping himself to fresh fruit. His presence no longer a question mark, but an accepted fact of our new configuration. Patricia and Robert, our legal advisors, occupied the end of the table, papers organized in neat stacks before them. "More coffee, Richard," Patricia offered, ever the careful observer. I nodded and she poured. Outside, the city hummed with its Sunday rhythm: traffic, distant sirens, the ambient noise of millions of people continuing their lives, unaware of how much had shifted in 3 months. Lucas abandoned his truck and climbed into Jonathan's lap, a gesture so natural now that I sometimes forgot it had ever been fragile. Jonathan wrapped an arm around him, kissed the top of his head, and returned his attention to me. No one commented on these moments anymore. They were simply what they were: a father and son rebuilding the trust someone else had tried to destroy. "He's doing well in preschool," Jonathan said, reading my observation. "Teachers say he's social engaged. No behavioral flags?" I nodded, satisfied. Lucas's healing was the only metric that had ever truly mattered. Whitmore Industries is stable. Jonathan began shifting into the professional cadence I'd heard develop over the past weeks. He pulled out a folder, restructured board minutes, ethics compliance certifications, shareholder communications. "We've implemented the governance overhaul, 3 independent directors, external audit committee, full transparency on all accounts." Nathan leaned forward, engaged. "The market response." "Auto positive," Jonathan confirmed. "Investors are cautious but responding to the clean slate. We've severed ties with every shell account, every subsidiary Edward used for laundering. Sterling Capital's backing legitimizes the rebuild." I listened more than I spoke. Jonathan had stepped into the role of CEO with a steadiness that shouldn't have surprised me. He'd been orchestrating cover stories and managing pressure for 3 years, but it did. The puppet had become the puppeteer, though now his hands held the strings of something constructive rather than destructive. The press release on the new ethics initiative launches Thursday. Patricia said, consulting her notes. Richard's going to be the public face, the man who brought down the Whitmore empire from within, now championing reform. It's a powerful narrative. Jonathan met my eyes. You're ready for that? I'd spent my career in shadows, moving money and orchestrating events that no one outside a very small circle ever knew about. Public exposure had never been part of the plan. But plans changed. I'm ready, I said. Part 3. The Public Reckoning. The media had reframed me. Where once I was a footnote, the retired Sterling Capital founder who'd appeared at a courthouse, now I was the hero. The whistleblower. The man who'd had the courage to expose his own partners, his own world, because justice demanded it. Your interview with Forbes is scheduled for next month, Patricia noted. They want the full story. How you uncovered the fraud. Your role in the investigation. The moral turning point. I'd given that story in abbreviated form, already enough to establish credibility without compromising the investigation or our family's privacy. The rest I would parcel out carefully, maintaining control over the narrative while appearing transparent. It was a delicate balance, the kind of thing I'd spent decades perfecting. I'll do it, I said. But the focus stays on ethics in business, accountability, governance, not on me. Nathan smiled. Good luck with that. The public wants a hero. You've earned it, perhaps. But heroes weren't built in one act. They were constructed through consistency, through time, through the slow accumulation of choices that proved intention. I had 3 months of evidence that I was serious about reform. By next year, if I stayed the course, I might have enough to convince myself, as well as everyone else. Lucas tugged at Jonathan's shirt, demanding attention. Jonathan lifted him, kissed his cheek, and Lucas pointed at the park beyond the windows. Birds, Daddy, birds. Jonathan agreed and carried him toward the glass to watch. Nathan watched them, something soft in his expression. Co-guardian was more than a legal designation for him. It meant something deeper, a place in this family he'd never expected to have secured now by both paperwork and genuine affection. Edward's trial begins in 2 months. Robert said, pulling the conversation back to the darker threads still unraveling. Based on current evidence, we're looking at 15 years minimum. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, extortion. I'd thought I'd feel satisfaction at that number. 15 years was a long time to contemplate the consequences of greed, but I felt only a hollow acknowledgement. The sentence was just, but justice was a poor substitute for the years Lucas might have lost had we moved slower. Victoria and I asked. Shoo. She accepted the plea deal, Patricia said. 5 years. She'll testify against Edward in exchange for the reduced sentence. Her defense claimed duress. Edward made her do it. The evidence suggests she was complicit but less central to the financial schemes. 5 years. She'd see Lucas grow from 4 to 9 before she left prison. The boy would have memories of her by then, but they'd be interrupted, fractured, overshadowed by the reality of her absence. That was its own kind of justice, I suppose. Not punishment, that wasn't my place, but consequence. Natural, inevitable consequence. Is Lucas prepared for that conversation? Nathan asked quietly. Jonathan was still at the window with the boy, pointing out birds, building a world where such darkness didn't exist. Not yet. Soon. When he asks for her more directly. Right now he understands Mom is away. That's enough. As brunch wound down and Patricia and Robert gathered their files to leave, I found myself watching my son and grandson at the window. Lucas was animated, alive, secure in the knowledge that Jonathan wasn't going anywhere. That Nathan had chosen to stay. That I, for all my shadows and orchestrations, had chosen them. The business world was watching now. Boardrooms in Manhattan and beyond were debating Sterling Capital's restructuring, Richard Harrison's transformation from deal-maker to reformer, the Whitmore Industries turnaround story. Some saw it as redemption. Others saw it as savvy PR. Neither was entirely wrong. The man who'd once built empires from darkness now walked in daylight. It was an unfamiliar place, one that required constant vigilance against the old instincts. But here in this room, with Lucas's laughter echoing and Jonathan's arm around Nathan's shoulder and the park spread beyond our windows like a promise kept here, it felt like the right choice. Jonathan carried Lucas back to the table and settled him in a chair with apple slices. The boy ate contentedly, secure in the rhythm of routine and presence. "What's next?" Nathan asked me. I considered the question. The trials would continue. The investigations would expand. Sterling Whitmore would grow. Lucas would turn 5, then 6. The story would evolve, layering itself with new chapters and unexpected turns. We keep building," I said. "We keep moving forward. We stay honest." It was a promise I was still learning to keep. But for the first time in my life, I had the time and the reason to learn it properly. The office was quiet. Evening had settled over Manhattan like a held breath, and I sat alone at my desk with a leather journal open before me. No recordings tonight, no orchestrations. Just the simple act of writing something I'd done rarely in the years when power meant keeping everything encrypted, compartmentalized, hidden. 20 years ago, I built Sterling Capital in darkness. I thought power meant control. I thought control meant moving people like pieces on a chessboard, bending outcomes through information and leverage and careful manipulation. I was good at it. Ruthless, yes, but effective. The kind of man who could move markets with a phone call and reshape lives with a signature. I was wrong. The journal sat before me like a confessional. I'd kept one during the 3-year infiltration, encrypted, buried in a safe deposit box, insurance against catastrophe. Now it was something different, a record of what I'd learned when my son's pain became impossible to ignore. 20 years of building empires. One moment of watching Jonathan's face when he realized Lucas wasn't biologically his that broke all 20 years into rubble. I set down the pen and closed my eyes, letting the memories play in sequence. Sterling Capital rising from seed capital to billions. Board meetings in glass towers. Handshakes that sealed fates. The reputation I'd cultivated, brilliant, untouchable, ice-cold, beneath an impeccable veneer. I'd been proud of that reputation. It meant no one could hurt me. It meant no one could disappoint me. It meant I never had to admit that beneath the walls I'd built something essential had corroded away. Then Jonathan came to me with Lucas in his arms, a boy who wasn't biologically his, but whom he loved with a fierceness that shattered my certainty. And I saw clearly that my son had chosen something I'd never mastered, vulnerability. The willingness to be broken and to keep loving anyway. The choice came after that. I could have buried what I suspected about Whitmore Industries, protected my investments, maintained my distance. Instead, I chose my son. I chose to orchestrate his protection rather than his advancement. I chose to dismantle the very machinery that had made me powerful, because that machinery was consuming my family. It was the easiest and hardest decision I'd ever made. I opened the journal again and wrote, "Love is not protecting someone from pain. It is teaching them how to survive pain, how to stand up from it, how to transform it into wisdom." The words felt insufficient. But language always did when it tried to capture the enormity of these past months. Power, I had learned, was not what I'd spent 20 years believing it to be. Real power wasn't the ability to bend others to your will. Real power was the ability to change yourself, to admit you'd been wrong, to rebuild your life and your values from the foundation up, knowing the world was watching, judging, waiting for you to fail. I stood and walked to the window. From this height, the city sprawled beneath me like a living organism, millions of lives intersecting and diverging and building toward tomorrow. In his own office 3 blocks away, Jonathan was reviewing quarterly reports, his signature on documents that would have once made me proud for their profitability alone. Now they made me proud for different reasons. The transparency audits, the ethical supply chains, the governance structures that ensured no one person could ever consolidate enough power to corrupt an entire corporation the way Edward had tried to do. Lucas was asleep in a bed that didn't carry the weight of a lie anymore. The boy had stopped asking when his mother was coming home. In his 5-year-old logic, he understood that some people made choices that took them away, and that was their consequence to bear, not his. Jonathan had given him that wisdom, the understanding that he could trust the people who stayed. Nathan moved through the world as a co-guardian now, not just biologically, but legally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. He'd accepted a role in the restructured Sterling Whitmore, overseeing the technology infrastructure that kept everything transparent and traceable. The three of us, the unlikely trinity of a retired mogul, a CEO son, and a biological father who'd waited years for his child, had become the architecture of something new. Edward Whitmore sat in a federal penitentiary, 15 years of his remaining life, spent contemplating the consequences of his greed. Victoria had accepted her 5 years, and she would emerge, if she emerged at all psychologically intact, to a world where her son had moved beyond needing her. These were not triumphs to boast about. They were necessary conclusions to a story that had nearly destroyed everyone involved. But the other story, the one that mattered, was still being written. I thought about blood and bonds, about how DNA determined biology but never determined love, about how family was not a matter of genetics or control, but of presence and choice, and the daily decision to show up, to be honest, to build something that would last. I was writing when Jonathan called. Still at the office. His voice carried that familiar blend of concern and amusement. He knew me too well to believe I was working. I just finished. I'm heading over. The drive to his apartment took 15 minutes. When I arrived, Lucas was already asleep. I could see him through the crack in his bedroom door, small and peaceful, under the glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. Jonathan sat on the couch with a glass of bourbon loosening his tie. We stood in the doorway of his bedroom, watching the boy sleep. 5 years old, secure in a love that had been tested and had held. Nathan had texted earlier. He was already setting up Lucas's weekend visit, a day at the park, a 3-man expedition into something that wouldn't have been possible a year ago. Jonathan put his hand on my shoulder. You did that. You gave us this. I shook my head. You did this. All I did was stop getting in the way. Through the window, the city sprawled, lights and movement, and the accumulated weight of millions of stories. Somewhere in those stories, Edward and Victoria were learning the cost of their choices. That was the justice system's work, not ours anymore. Blood does not define family. Sacrifice and love do. That was the truth I'd finally learned, not in the darkness where I'd spent 20 years, but in the light, surrounded by the people who'd chosen each other, despite every reason not to. The reckoning was complete. The healing had begun. And for the first time in my life, I understood what power truly meant. Looking back at my own story, I see a man who spent 20 years building empires in darkness, believing that control equaled love. I was wrong. Dead wrong. If you're watching this, let me be clear, don't be like I was. Don't mistake power for protection. Don't let ambition blind you to the people suffering right beside you. I almost lost everything, my son, my grandson, my humanity, because I thought I could orchestrate my way to safety. I couldn't. The real lesson here, the one I had to learn the hard way, is this: love means surrendering control. It means admitting you don't have all the answers. It means fighting for those you love, not with manipulation, but with truth. When I finally chose Jonathan over my business empire, when I chose to expose corruption instead of protecting it, when I chose to stand in that courtroom and say my name, That's when I became a real man again. 3 times I prayed in this story. Once when Jonathan first showed me Lucas. Once when we recorded Edward's confession. And once more when that judge granted custody to my son. I'm not a religious man, but in those moments I understood that some things are bigger than strategy. Some things are sacred. God doesn't reward empire builders who work in shadows. He rewards those who stand in the light even when it costs everything. To everyone watching, protect your children fiercely. Expose lies boldly. Choose love over power. It's the only victory that lasts. Final disclaimer. This narrative contains dramatized storytelling elements for educational purposes. While inspired by real events, some details are fictionalized. However, the core lessons about recognizing financial and emotional abuse are absolutely authentic. If this style doesn't resonate with you, that's perfectly okay. Please seek content better suited to your needs.